All right, good evening, Azeroth, and welcome to episode 122 of the World of Goldcraft. I'm your host, as always, the Lazy Goldmaker of thelazygoldmaker.com. Welcome back to the show. Once again, I'm doing this live on Twitch, so if you're interested in catching us live, then head over to twitch.tv/lazygoldmaker. And I do this on Thursdays at about 8 Central European time. And if you're watching along in chat, make sure you post your questions and I'll get to those at the end. So, of course, the podcast is made available by my patrons that, amongst other things, can get access to my full TSM setup. So if you're interested in that, head over to patreon.com/thelazygoldmaker. And, of course, thelazygoldmaker.com for all of your gold making guide needs. That's where you want to be. So, without further ado, let's start talking about gold making, or other World of Warcraft first and foremost. So what's going on this week? Well, right now there's the time walking event, or it just started, which honestly doesn't have much of an impact. There are some things you can do. There's like some old world enchants and gems that are the best for time walking, but this is a small market. More importantly, we're still doing the Love is in the Air event. So you can still farm the Swift Lovebird. You can still buy the Swift Lovebird for a relatively cheap price. I'm going to probably buy some today and pick up and just keep those for about half a year to 9 months when I'll try selling them again. So just buy a couple, stick them in a guild bank, and most likely you'll be able to make some money. Now, more importantly than this, and what happened just like a couple hours before I started recording, is Blizzard screwed up. They posted publicly, or at least exposed publicly, some of their press releases for BlizzConline this weekend. And this includes patch 9.1 and TBC Classic. All of the content, I'm not going to talk about any of the lore revelations for a 9.1, because I know some people care a lot about spoilers. But what I will talk about is what we get in terms of content. So we're getting a new raid with 10 bosses. We're getting a new 8-boss mythic dungeon, similar to Mechagon, which presumably will be M0 only. And a new zone or sub-zone in the Maw. I'm not quite sure how that exactly will function, because obviously we only have like the marketing blurbs and not any of the hard data. I doubt we get any new materials. I don't really expect that. And outside of that, of course, we'll for sure be getting new items, new recipes, new mounts, everything you get. Probably items you can trade, probably items you can craft. I'm expecting like the highlights to be Crafters Mark 3 and new base legendaries, but there might be some other goodies as well. We'll see. So that's going to be quite exciting. I'm sure by the time the weekend comes around, we'll be hearing a lot more over BlizzConline on what's coming. So we'll have an even better idea of what this patch might mean for gold making, which I'm sure all of you care about. TBC Classic is coming as well, and they're coming this year, from the announcement that they didn't make, but that they inadvertently leaked. Of course, the press release did not really contain any of the important economic information that those of you playing Classic would care about. So that would include stuff like whether or not we will continue from our Classic servers, or if you start fresh. Gold making in TBC will likely function very similarly to Classic, but there will be more relevant. And with that I mean consumables are going to be king. That's going to be the best way to make gold, most likely. There will be some more new things, and profession balance will be a lot weirder, because everyone who's doing raiding, literally every raider who cares even a bit about their performance, will be going leatherworking for drums. So drum demand will probably be really high, just like sapper charge demand was really, really high in WoW Classic. And it's going to make, of course, profit margins in many of the other professions a lot higher, because people they're just going to have one slot on their main for professions. So I think professions will be really good. Of course, jewel crafting makes its debut, which historically was my absolute favorite gold making profession. But sadly, it has been nurtured, and gems have just been nerfed and essentially removed from the game as an interesting item or even something to profit off of. So that's a little sad, but we'll have to live with that. So that's about it for the news, and that's some pretty big news. I'm sure we'll be talking more about it next week. Hopefully, we get some more updates after BlizzCon or BlizzCon Online about how these things are actually going to be implemented. Like, how are they going to implement TBC servers and all that jazz? So that'll be fun. 2 more days, yeah. So, what I wanted to talk about today was something I've written about this a couple of years ago, and it's the major phases of an expansion, or like the expansion life cycle. Because I'm sure many people are coming into gold making every day, and many people are coming into WoW every day, or every week, every expansion. And all of the expansions follow a very typical structure in terms of how content is released on like a timeline, and that also means that it's very structured what people are doing. So of course some of this will be a little bit out of date because I'll be talking about the first patch, which is behind us for the most part, but we'll talk about the rest as well. So right now, of course, the first patch, the initial patch and Gearing Rush, this is the craziest time of an expansion. This is the gold rush for sure, where fortunes can be made and lost. Players are rushing to get to the max level cap, getting professions leveled, gearing up, clearing raids, getting into PvP. Demand for everything and anything is super high. Items sell fast, prices are as high as they ever go. There are some turbulent times during the first couple of weeks. There are some tricks you can take advantage of that I've talked about in the past. Of course, not relevant since the expansion is over. Or the expansion isn't over, but the first patch is over. And we're past that. We're past that initial gearing rush. We're now in the first sort of slowdown period. But yeah, during the first part of the patch, you can make a lot of gold doing almost anything. Farming materials is good because demand is really high. Crafting is really good, particularly if you can get any hard to get recipes that people want for PvE endgame gameplay. That's going to be extremely profitable often. Like base legendaries were incredibly profitable for many players this expansion, and some people just spent and finally started making it back weeks after launch, like me. But I did make it back, and focusing on specific hard-to-get recipes, if any such exist that are valuable for raiding, is usually a great way to make a lot of gold. But as I said, this initial rush is in the past now, when we're talking about Shadowlands. We are behind it. We are at the point where people start to finish off their major progress-oriented goals for patch 9.0. What that means is that players care less and less about their performance. Well, on average, they're at least willing to pay less for any performance increasing item. All of the most hardcore players already have geared their main, so they're not buying BOEs anymore, for instance. People have their rank 4 legendary, so they don't need more. Maybe they want some on their alt, but they don't care about that as much. And prices on everything just sort of starts trending downwards, and we already seen on my realms, Callicides, for instance, are now down to like 40% of what it was for weeks on end. And that trend is going to continue for a while. There are always going to be players progressing through the game, though, so you can almost always make a profit with most crafted items, most consumables, and stuff like that. But the profit margin might stay the same, but the raw profit and the raw gold that you generate will be going downwards from those markets. But this is also a time where players turn their attention to other parts of the game than end game stuff. So what that means is they start looking at their mount collections and their transmog collections and their battle pet collections, or leveling an alt. And if they level an alt, then maybe they're willing to buy a bunch of catch-up gear to quickly get into the content they care about. So that's what we typically see at this point, like catch-up gear, bags, cosmetics, anything else starts picking up and is generally at a better place than what they are, particularly during an expansion launch where everyone is just hyper-focused on the current expansion. But yeah, catch-up gear and stuff like that starts working out pretty well from about this point on. Right now, of course, in Shadowlands, that means Crafter's Mark II gear, BOE flipping or BOE farming, base legendaries potentially, at least the lower ranks, and of course all transmog, all mounts, all pets, all of that stuff is gonna have a fairly good period. Now, generally speaking, for the subsequent content updates, we'll expect to see 3 major patches and some smaller ones with like 0.5 in between. 9.1, of course, as I touched on in the beginning, we'll get a new raid, a new dungeon, and a continuation to the quest lines. I doubt we'll see any major recipes, but always when you get new content, a lot of people go back into the game to check it out. A lot of people go back into progress mode where they care a lot about performance, which means they buy more consumables, they buy more gear, they spend more gold on increasing the power of their character. So generally speaking, prices on materials used in anything that's related to raiding or high M+ will usually have a spike around the launch of a new patch, as long as they're still used. So this is a great time to be active in the gold making part of the game. There are some tricks you can do, of course, with like potentially buying stuff when it's cheap just before the launch of 9.1. We're not quite there yet, though. Prices will likely trend downwards for a while before you get to the point where you should buy. And if you buy at the right time, then it's going to be great. If you buy at the wrong time, then you might not make your gold back. So this is definitely in the risky situation. And then eventually the cycle will repeat. People will be finished with most of their 9.1 goals. And we'll be going on into a new content lull where people focus more on cosmetics, alts, and collections. Then 9.2 will bring a similar resurgence. But the second patch usually adds something more than the first one. They usually introduce a new major zone. This was the case the last 2 expansions. We may get new materials. This was a little bit different. In Legion, we got new materials in the final patch with Argus, whereas in BFA we got new materials with Nashatar in 8.2. This will likely bring some recipes. Usually new consumables come out about this time of an expansion. And getting these kinds of recipes early is usually extremely lucrative, so if any of them are gated behind some kind of farm, then that's something you will want to target heavily in that patch. With a new raid and people coming back in to check out the new stuff, we get a new surge in materials, but likely to a lower peak than the last patch. Like the general trend is going to be downwards for the rest of the expansion, with some short peaks upwards. Usually as well, you'll see higher competition at the end of the expansion. Generally speaking, a lot of gold makers have been playing the game for a very long time, and I think that at the end of an expansion, you're likely to have a higher proportion of the player base being players who take one or more aspects of the game quite seriously. So a higher proportion of the people posting on the auction house will be gold makers, or people who are more hardcore about gold making than the average population. And that usually means higher competition, and can be a bit harder to get the sale, and profit margins are usually suffering as well. Then we get to the final patch, likely 9.3. New raids, new zones, new whatever, and the final massive hurrah for Shadowlands. Hopefully, people are super hyped and have enjoyed the expansion thus far, and it isn't like BFA where people were really down on the overall expansion experience. It always draws in players, and then eventually we clear the raid and we get ready for the inevitable decline, as all of the Shadowlands related markets just slowly peter out. Of course, what's interesting is that almost always Current expansion crafting, current expansion items keep selling all the way up until the final week, the final day of the last expansion. Like I was selling, what was the name? Uncanny Combatant gear like a week before Shadowlands dropped. Because it's still the best item for that specific niche all the way until the next expansion actually launches. So nothing ever dies. Eventually you get the pre-patch, which brings in a lot of players, and a lot of players roll alts or roll new characters for the next expansion around that time. So that's also usually a resurgence for like stuff like max level gearing, particularly with how fast it is to level to max level right now. We're gonna see a lot of new characters around then, and most likely a lot of people will want to take those characters for a spin in PvP and PvE to get a feel for if they like them with any class changes that's made, and they'll want to make sure that they actually enjoy playing it before they commit to that character for the next expansion cycle. So that's sort of it. It generally follows like a hype and very peaked portion during a raid release when people care a lot about what they're doing, their character's power, and just need everything. They need to level their profession, they need to do everything, and then it just starts trending downwards as more and more people get past the hump. They get past, like, they reach their major goals for gearing, for instance. Like, I've reached all my major goals for gearing on my Warlock. I have enough gold or enough gear to kill Denathrius on Heroic. And since that's the current ambition for our guild, like, there's no point in me working hardcore on gear anymore. So I'm sort of done on my Warlock there. So I don't really buy new base legendaries or stuff at the moment. Whereas the first couple of weeks after launch, I was buying new every week. When I got to the next Soul Ash cap, I was upgrading. So yeah, that's sort of it. Jack in chat says maybe the drop in value will be less than normal because of the no multi-boxers. No, that's not. I don't think that's going to have an impact at all, because we've never had multi-boxers in Shadowlands. So we're going to have, relative to the current balance of supply and demand, demand is going to drop, and supply is going to drop as well. Of course, fewer people will be farming as fewer people play the game, but you can't really, like, the huge difference in demand is just gonna take the cake. Like, the demand is so high during the initial phases of a new content patch that it's not sustainable. So you'll always see a major drop in value after that. Then we have a question from one of my patrons as well. This was asked on the Discord server, and I thought it would be an interesting one to talk about. So if you guys are watching this, have any you want me to look at as well, now's the time to get them in. What's your strategy for items that have a low sale rate, for instance, less than 0.05? Do you continue posting it? What information do you use to decide to stop posting on the auction house and sell to a vendor? Personally, I don't actually pay much attention to sale rate because I just try to avoid the items where I would even have to do the math to figure out if the sale rate is too low relative to the deposit cost. Because I already know what type of items this is. What are the items that you might want to sell that has a high deposit cost? Those are items with high vendor prices, which generally means gear. And the only gear people aren't willing to pay a decent chunk of gold for is transmog. So the easy way is to just avoid lower value transmog completely. And that's what I do. But of course, there are ways to get around this. Like, generally speaking, I would say avoid most transmog or gear that sells for less than 5,000 gold, unless it is current expansion gear. Like, I'll sell item level 168 rings for 300 gold because I know that they sell really, really quickly. But I'm not going to sell like some crafted vanilla transmog for 300 gold, because that has a completely different value proposition. The deposit costs are going to be much higher because the expected sale rate is super, super low. And And I actually just ignore my sale rates and deposit costs. I have items that I've probably posted for years for like a huge loss in deposit costs. But having to micromanage that seems to me to be just much less valuable than just doing post scans and not thinking about it and eventually getting the sale if the item is valuable. There are some things you can do in TSM. I know Billis and Exia has written about this on the subreddit. You can make a custom source that represents the expected value of deposit costs. And you can just check if the value of the item is less than what you'd have to pay to post it, then you can just go vendor it right away. But as I said, I personally haven't even implemented that because I don't find it worth my time. I'd rather just avoid those items completely and leave some gold for someone who is interested in that market. So yeah, guys, we're at the 21 minutes now, so that's going to be the end of the show. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did and you want to read about gold making, then head over to thelazygoldmaker.com. If you want to support the show, you can do so at patreon.com/thelazygoldmaker or by subscribing and liking the video when this is posted to YouTube. It really helps me out. Thanks for joining me, and good luck.